I'm Aaron Fogleman. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm a history professor, so guess what? We're going to do some history today. That's the way it is with me. Which means we're going to start out with a quiz. I hope you're ready for a pop quiz. All right, here it is. When did slavery legally end in the United States? I need the event, the day, the month, and the year. Who wants to take a shot at it? Glenda. June 65, but that's a good guess and a good thought, but that's not it. The key. See, that's what you do. You try to encourage people when they get it wrong, so they keep coming back. The key is, when did it legally end? Not in a de facto way, where I'm finally out of this slavery, but when did it actually end legally? I'll give you a clue. When did the 13th Amendment take effect? The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
67?
No? No? All right. I'll save you further suspense. Okay. Remember what the Constitution says. If you want to amend it, Congress has to pass an amendment, and then the states have to ratify it. And 3/4 of the states have to ratify it before it takes effect. So it's not just the 13th Amendment. If you saw Spielberg's movie on Lincoln, you remember all the celebration when they passed it in Congress. Slavery was still legal because 27 out of 36 states had to ratify it before it would take effect. The first state to ratify was Illinois on the 1st of February, 1865. It's still during the war. The 27th state was Georgia, and that took place on the 6th of December, 1865, and the vote by Georgia was certified on the 18th of December, 1865, thus making slavery in the United States illegal, just before Christmas that year. The other states, they continued. Iowa and New Jersey ratified the 13th Amendment in 1866. Texas didn't do it until 1870. Delaware, not until 1901. Kentucky, not until 1976. And the last, number 36, was Mississippi, which ratified the 13th Amendment on the 16th of March, 1995, and their vote was not certified until the 7th of February, 2013, 10 years ago. But the key date for ending it was just before Christmas, 1865. Okay, so now let's look at our congregation. We've heard the story about Augugstus Conant from Kevin O'Neill and others. I think he's up there looking over my shoulder, watching me to make sure I get this right. I hope I do. He became the minister here in 1842, and he was removed from the pulpit in 1857 because of his abolitionism. He was welcomed back after his death, actually. He died during the war in 1863, and they brought him back and buried him near here. So from that point onwards, he was essentially welcomed back, even though he died. So the question I have is, who removed him from this pulpit right here, and why? What did the majority in our church believe about slavery at the time, and why? And how did what happened within these walls reflect what happened throughout the country? And last, what does this tell us about slavery, memory, and the politics of change and social justice then and now. So that's what I want to talk about today. Let's start with some background to Conant's time. It's a tale of a nation divided over slavery, but not quite like you might think. Slavery was attacked during the American Revolution, and the system was in tatters by the end of the war. But of course, it survived. The revolution led to the banning of the transatlantic slave trade, the slave ships bringing so many people in, gradual emancipation in the northern states, and thousands of personal, individual emancipations in the upper South. Also, Black leaders in the country, in the new republic, began appropriating revolutionary and Christian ideals to attack slavery. And enslaved Black people began turning to Christianity in massive numbers for the first time. This was the beginning of the link of Christianity to the civil rights struggle in this country, which continued throughout the 20th century and in some ways to this day. But the revolutionary generation, with its lofty proclamations, passed without ending slavery. In fact, it continued in the South and spread into the Southwest to the Mississippi River and beyond. Part of one of the greatest paradoxes in Atlantic history is that during the age of emancipation, the so-called second slavery became dominant in the United States, Brazil, and Cuba. And it was connected to the growth of capitalism in the Atlantic world. Now, in the long generation before the Civil War, what we call the antebellum era, a spectrum of political beliefs emerged in the United States that almost everybody adhered to. The first, got a number of terms and beliefs in this political spectrum that I want to explain. Some will be more familiar to you than others. The first is abolition. The abolitionists believed in the immediate, full legal freedom to all enslaved people because slavery was wrong. Imagine that. People actually believed that. The abolitionists. There were Black abolitionists and white abolitionists. Blacks like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. Whites like William Lloyd Garrison, the newspaper editor. Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, and Augugstus Conant. Most whites in the North and South considered the abolitionists to be dangerous radicals and lunatics. Elijah Lovejoy, the abolitionist newspaper editor and a minister, was murdered in Alton, Illinois in 1837 for his views. As late as the 1970s, the majority of mainstream U.S. history scholars still held these views that abolitionists were radicals. There was a lunatic element to them. Many people believed that. Okay, so those are the abolitionists, including Conant. Colonization. And this one is probably not familiar to very many of you, but it's an important part of the political spectrum on slavery during this period. It's a new concept that emerged in the wake of the American Revolution. And the idea was that, first of all, the revolution began to indicate to a lot of white people, Black people already knew this, that something is wrong with slavery. What's the solution? The abolitionists had their solution. The colonizationists had a quite different one. And the idea was to gradually end slavery, because it was wrong, and then remove the Black population from the country. Both white people and Black people promoted migration of freed slaves to Africa. Tens of thousands of people were liberated and went to various West African colonies during this era. This included enslaved people who ran away during the American Revolutionary War and ended up in the new British colony of Sierra Leone in West Africa. It also included U.S. freedmen and freedwomen who began going to Liberia after 1822, founded the new state there. And also in Brazil, freedmen and freedwomen began going to a similar colony in Aguda, in what is now Nigeria. From Black perspectives, it meant a return to the African homeland, an escape from the land of sorrow and enslavement. From white perspectives, this is pretty ugly. The idea was to solve the problem of slavery and race relations by getting rid of the Black population. That's the idea. Hundreds of U.S. colonization societies were founded in the North and the South. Thomas Jefferson was a colonizationist. Abraham Lincoln believed in colonization until the 1850s. I'm not sure if colonization took root in the Geneva Congregation, but elements of it probably did. The concept of separating races became a guiding principle of segregation in the future, in the 20th century, and also apartheid. And this included some Black leaders in the 20th century, like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, who believed in the separation of the races. Now, another part of the political spectrum, at least somewhat familiar to you, I imagine, is just an overt defense of slavery. There had been no significant challenge to slavery from white people until the American Revolution. So before 1776, there was no need for them to defend it. No one was attacking it. After 1776, white and Black challenges were nearly constant. In the antebellum era, Southern white leaders responded to these challenges with a stout defense of slavery. One of the leaders was John C. Calhoun. He was a senator from South Carolina and vice president under Andrew Jackson. If you saw Spielberg's movie Amistad, you'll remember him as the bad guy, the senator who was promoting all of this. But beginning in 1837, he gave a famous speech about slavery being a positive good, not a necessary evil. There were many people in this camp who used the Bible to defend slavery. And if you want to do that, you can. It's right there. One of the favorite sections that they quoted from the Bible was from the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verses 5 to 9 from the King James Version. I'll read it to you. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, and singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord, and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. And ye masters, do the same things unto them, forbearing, threatening, knowing that your master also is in heaven, neither is there respect of persons with him. Now, this was the era of the revival, the great second religious revival we call the Second Great Awakening. It was the peak of Protestant culture, the influence of Protestant culture in this country, and the influence of the King James Version of the Bible for all of American history, right in this era it peaked. So this was really important to a lot of people. For many white Southerners, ending slavery was incomprehensible. Slavery had been written into the Constitution. The South never would have ratified it had it not protected slavery. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, the most important founding fathers and leaders of the Revolution all owned slaves. The abolitionist threat to them was not just about the threat to end slavery, which they defended so rigorously. To them, it was about threatening the revolution itself, freedom and democracy. This is one of the greatest paradoxes in American history, the view that you had to have slavery to have freedom. Okay, another view on the political spectrum is one of compromise. The belief that slavery was a national political problem. It was not a moral problem. It was not about people who were actually suffering. You just don't think about that. This is obviously a very white view in both North and South. The key was whether or not slavery would be allowed in the new territories that were being acquired with the westward expansion and conquest from sea to shining sea. From independence until the U.S. victory in the Mexican War in 1848, this was a contentious political issue as more land was always taken. But the view here in this camp was the best solution was to avoid disunion and or war through political compromise. So that's what they did. This was actually the political view that was carrying the day for most of this period. After the revolution, the compromise began. New territories in the North forbade slavery, haltingly and with exceptions, but they didn't. And the new territories in the South expanded it, and slavery grew tremendously there. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, westward conquest led to new territories being organized and applying for admission into the Union. They wrote constitutions, and as they did this, the great question was, would they allow slavery? Would the new state be a slave state or a free state? And each time it became a national political debate. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was settled fairly painlessly. This is for the territory of the Louisiana Purchase. And it worked for about a generation. Roughly, northern areas can be free states, or must be free states, and southern areas must be slave states. The national political parties brokered these compromises for managing slavery, and they prevented disunion and war by doing so. The Mexican War, that's the war when the U.S. attacked Mexico and conquered, then it marched into Mexico City and just took the northern half of Mexico in the Treaty of 1848. The annexations there of what is now the southwest of the United States changed everything. The questions arose again. Would there be the new territories be slave or free? It became an explosive issue that they never could resolve, and it led directly to the Civil War in 1861. The parties of compromise failed during this era, and war was the result. So that's the compromise faction, or part of the spectrum, if you will. The next is one you've probably not heard of at all. It's the most important, I think, for the congregation here in Geneva. It's called the Free Soil Movement. So just bear with me on this. I'll explain this. It's a little complicated. This was a huge movement in the Midwest, including Illinois, including Abraham Lincoln, and including Geneva. This ultimately is what most people sitting in these pews, I think, believed when they removed Conant in 1857. The idea was to keep the newly conquered territories in the West free. No slavery there. Because this was the way, the place where Americans, free Americans, could go of all walks of life and be all they could be, to make it big in America and achieve freedom and opportunity in growing, expanding republic. So free soil, keep the new territories free, no slavery there. Now there's an ugly, racist tone to the Free Soilers and to the Republicans who adopted this view, the new Republican Party, to include Abraham Lincoln. They correctly perceived that slavery would be the primary vehicle to bring Black people into the new territories, and they did not want them there. They didn't care if slavery existed in the Old South. They want it, let them keep it. We don't want it. They just didn't want expansion. Keep the West for whites only. That is the ideology. So you notice this theme of racial separation here that was also present in colonization, the colonization view. Now there are really important differences between this free soil mentality and the view of most white Southerners. The Free Soilers and the new Republican Party did not believe in slavery. They didn't like it. They recognized the basic humanity of enslaved and Black people. Thus, they believed that Black people should have some basic legal rights and economic livelihood. And the idea was everyone should have this, even if they're inferior. And they did believe they were inferior, but that doesn't mean they don't have some basic rights and opportunities. So that's an important difference with the Free Soilers. But there should be no political rights for Black people who should be kept away from white people. Lincoln followed this line and was opposed to Black suffrage because of it, and he promoted colonization into the 1850s. He changed later, but that's where he was in the 1850s. In the 1840s and 50s, many people in the North were increasingly worried about the so-called slave power conspiracy. Southern elements were taking over the national government and promoting slavery everywhere. They were going to bring slavery to Illinois if you let them have their way, including Kane County, including Geneva, and they didn't want that. They were depriving Northern whites of their chance to be all they could be in the West and live essentially the American dream, if you will, because they were going to try to bring the apparatus of slavery there, which they despised. So those who were for compromise wanted to control the slave power conspiracy and continue to broker compromise on the political issue of slavery in the new territories. The Free Soilers and the new Republican Party wanted no compromise in the West. They wanted to keep slavery out, period. So in this climate of increasing tension in the 1850s, with people on all sides insisting that their view was the best for America, the compromise view began to fail. The two-party system that had brokered compromise over slavery in the territories since the Revolution collapsed. The abolitionists remained a radical fringe, but they would not go away. Colonization faded away because nobody could find a way to make it work. Meanwhile, the pro-slavery parties, the movements, and the free soil movements grew stronger throughout the 1850s. In 1852, there was a new party. It was called the Free Soil Party. It got 6% of the vote in the presidential election and was particularly strong in Kane County. But that's not much. And the Free Soil Party didn't last, but their ideas grew and took hold in the new Republican Party, and especially by 1856, and most especially by 1860. So remember, the Republican Party was founded in 1854. Back in these days, they were the liberals. They didn't begin turning conservative until the 1920s. So imagine that, Republicans as liberals, how things change. But so it was. In 1860, Lincoln and the new Republican Party won the presidential election and Congress, and free soilism was the most important plank in their political platform. So it was essentially a political victory for free soilism in 1860. The land of Lincoln, especially northern Illinois, strongly followed this line, and that is what the majority of this congregation wanted, and that is why they removed Augugstus Conant in 1857, because he was an abolitionist, which they did not want. So during the war, over the course of the war, 1861 to 1865, almost all of the Free Soilers and Republicans turned abolitionists. They changed and drifted essentially toward abolitionism. Didn't begin that way. To white Northerners, the Civil War became a war about abolition and ending slavery altogether, not just in the West. To Black people in the North and South, it had always been about that. It just took longer for the white people to figure it out as far as they were concerned. When our congregation welcomed back Conant and buried him in the middle of the war, after the Emancipation Proclamation, it both followed and reflected this political shift in the North. So, why does this matter now? There are perhaps conflicting messages in this story. History is complicated. That's just the way it is. Sorry. But what happened here speaks to the issue of whether to pursue compromise or not in time of growing political tensions, violence, and division. If you don't compromise, the result might be war. Or if you don't compromise, the result might be long, continuous warfare, which we're seeing in Ukraine right now. Maybe there's something to be said for promoting social justice in the long term, gradually to avoid war, but then you must make a choice: when, how, and how much. And consider Martin Luther King's admonition against compromise, gradualism, and passivity, because it ignores the lot of people who are actually suffering. This case also speaks to difficulties for the majority to respond to voices of change. In hindsight, UUSG to this day is proud of Conant and his abolition, but back when it mattered most, they were against him. But our congregation could have done a lot worse, given some of the alternatives I described. At least they did eventually come around, and like most of the rest of the country, one way or another, after the Emancipation Proclamation, they welcomed back in death their old minister, Augugstus Conant, the abolitionist, who had just died for the cause. Last, what happened here speaks to the issue of remembering slavery and what the Civil War was about. Was it about ending as opposed to protecting slavery? Was it about preserving the Union as opposed to self-defense? Was it about defending revolutionary ideals? How do you decide what a war is about? That's a very complicated question. It certainly was at the time for members of this congregation, who finally decided the cause was to preserve the Union and get rid of slavery. After 1865, the debate raged over what the war was about, and views changed over time. The debate continues, and it's connected to the ongoing culture wars over, for example, Civil War monuments. So in some ways, the Civil War continues. The past is never dead. It's not even past. Thank you for listening, and amen.
Visit us at uusg.org.